On. Welcome back to the panel 6, which will be focused on the religion, symbolism, and cultural heritage. For this panel, we have two speakers, and our first speaker is Ms. Tenzin Nyima Bhutia. She is an assistant professor of English at the Sikkim Manipal University and a PhD scholar in English at Sikkim University, Gangtok. Her interests center on the rite, rituals, custom, and traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, with an emphasis on folklore and the oral narratives of the Eastern Himalaya. And for the today's session, she will be speaking on under Cloak and the culture, the Spy-cum-Ethnographer, Sarat Chandra Das, and Tibetan Buddhism in the Eastern Himalaya. So please, Nimala, can you please start the presentation?
Since we discussed a lot about AI generation and all this study, this is just a disclaimer that I'm going to use this title slide in order to incorporate as much as possible in the that is present there in the paper. Other than that, I really could not find a better looking Sarat Chandra Das on the web, so I have decided to retain this one. Good morning to one and all present here today. This is my second time here at Young Scholars Conference, Young Indian Scholars Conference. And as bad as I am with striking a conversation at the right time, I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude and also the fact that I was very happy when I saw many but familiar faces again, right? So yes, and I would like to continue doing so until I myself am no longer qualified as young anymore. So my name is Tenzin Bhutia. I am an assistant professor of English at Sikkim Manipal University, CDOE. And this paper that I'm going to present is a collaborative work with my colleague Pawan Rai, Mr. Pawan Rai, who is assistant professor and also head of the Department of Political Science at the same institution. So together we've titled the paper Under Cloak and Culture, the Spy-cum-Ethnographer, Sarat Chandra Das, and Tibetan Buddhism in the Eastern Himalayan regions. So through this paper, we aim to revisit the image of Sarat Chandra Das, often remembered as a British spy. And instead, we explore him as one of the earliest Indian ethnographers and cultural interpreters of Tibetan Buddhism, whose writings reveal a deep engagement with rituals, with philosophy, and lived religion of the region. So this paper has been structured in 5 sections. It begins with an introduction, of course, where we attempt to reposition Sarat Chandra Das as more than a colonial intermediary. The second section, the Great Game and the Pandit System, it explores the colonial politics of intelligences that framed his journey to Tibet. The third section, Sarat Chandra Das Spy-cum-Ethnographer, examines how his observations transcend espionage and evolve into genuine ethnographic engagement. And the fourth section focuses on Tibetan Buddhist rituals, particularly how he documented their performances and how these continue to shape Buddhist cultural identity in the Eastern Himalayan regions of India today. Specifically, my research field, fieldwork areas have been Kalimpong and Sikkim. So the British developed what they called the Pandit system, where trained Indian explorers, often surveyors, scholars, and monks, were sent to gather intelligence in Tibet and Central Asia. And these men were known as Pandits, not just because they carried surveying instruments disguised in rosaries or prayer wheels, but also because they were deeply learned. So some of the most important among them were Nain Singh Rawat, who secretly mapped Lhasa, Kishan Singh, who extended those surveys into the Tsangpo Valley. We have Kintup Lepcha from Sikkim, who was sent to trace the Tsangpo Brahmaputra connection, but was enslaved for years in Tibet, on which there was a presentation last year as well. And of course, Sarat Chandra Das, whose missions combined political intelligence and cultural immersion.
Now, existing studies like Peter Hopkirk's The Great Game, Derek Wallace, The Pundits, they have meticulously described the political and cartographic outcomes of these expeditions. However, what remains missing is a recognition of these pundits, especially Sarat Chandra Das, as knowledge producers and cultural interpreters, not merely instruments of the empire. So Sarat Chandra Das was a remarkable Indian figure whose life story blends espionage with profound scholarship and cultural immersion in the late 19th century. And he was initially trained as a civil engineer, which later came in handy to prove invaluable for his clandestine missions. However, it was his exceptional aptitude for his language and his keen interest in Tibetan culture that truly defined his unique trajectory. Now, he undertook two significant journeys to Tibet. His first expedition occurred in 1879 and lasted for 6 months. A more extensive second journey followed in 1881, spanning 14 months, during which he traveled to Lhasa, the Tibetan capital. He often adopted the guise of a Buddhist scholar or pilgrim, utilizing his deep understanding of Tibetan language and culture to blend in and collect invaluable information that would otherwise have been unattainable. So beyond his role as a British spy, Das emerged as a linguist and a dedicated Buddhist scholar. So there are texts, there are articles written on him, which I have pasted a little, the topic of the article is there, The Forgotten Tale of Intriguing Bengali Spy Who Fell in Love with Tibet, and his works such as Journey to Lhasa, The Diary of a Spy. These are the works which provides a unique first-person account of his daring and transformative travels. So these papers identify major research gaps, 3 major research gaps. First being Das's ethnographic depth has been overlooked. Not saying it has not been looked at, but then saying it has been underexplored. His detailed notes on Tibetan rituals, monastic architecture, and sacred geography in Narrative of a Journey to Lhasa and Central Tibet, they show an observational precision that goes beyond espionage. Second, the contributions of other Indian Pandits are marginalized in colonial historiography. Their experiences demonstrate a distinctly Indian intellectual presence within the colonial machinery. Third, and most crucially, the intersection between espionage, translation, and religion, it remains underexplored. Das's journey blurs these lines, his intelligence work transformed into an act of translation and devotion, carrying Buddhist knowledge into a new textual and linguistic life. So through this lens, the paper attempts to reclaim Sarat Chandra Das as an early ethnographer and cultural mediator of the eastern Himalayan region, rather than passive instruments of the empire. The first problem that this paper identifies is the problem is not in the way that Sarat Chandra Das has been persistently represented as a spy, but how overlooked his works or documentations, or so to say, colonial and even modern works like Peter Hopkirk's Trespassers on the Roof of the World. These works have emphasized the secrecy of his mission but ignored the richness of his observations. The second problem is the lack of ethnographic recognition in Buddhist studies. Despite being one of the earliest Indian scholars to document Tibetan rituals such as the Cham, Phurpa, Torma offerings, and Losar celebrations, Das has not found a place in the canon. The third problem involves the colonial mediation of his writings, as much of his works was edited and annotated by British officials. So the paper seeks to address these problems by reclaiming Sarat Chandra Das as an ethnographer of Tibetan Buddhism, whose writings embody both textual translation and cultural devotion. When we look at Sarat Chandra Das' travel accounts, what stands out is not just his mapping of routes or collection of intelligence for British Empire, but the painstaking way in which he documented Tibetan Buddhist rituals. And for me, this is where his works have become ethnographic, where he begins to resemble not just the stereotypical spy under cloak, but a cultural interlocutor, someone who looked at the lived religion of Tibet with both curiosity and admiration. One of the most vivid description in Journey to Lhasa in central Tibet is of the Cham ritual dance at Tashilhumpo Monastery. So Das paints a picture of monks donning elaborate masks of wrathful deities and demons, dancing in carefully choreographed sequence while cymbals clashed, drums beat, and thigh-bone trumpets produced a song unlike anything he had encountered before. The ritual culminated in the burning of effigies meant to exorcise evil spirits and purify the space. He called it a sacred drama, recognizing that Cham was not entertainment but pedagogy. So now if we move forward to the present, Cham remains central in the ritual calendar of eastern Himalayan regions of India, such as Pema Yangtze Monastery, Rumtek Monastery, Jangdok Palri, Photang and Kalimpong, and many such monasteries where Cham continues to be performed annually, often during Losar or other festivals. The masks, costumes and sequences are strikingly similar to what Das described. However, where Das saw Cham largely within the monastery walls, today it has shifted, as in it has become a community festival, attracting not only lay devotees but also visitors and tourists. Please excuse me, I would like to have a sip of water because it feels like my mouth is drying and my lips are like starting to stick to my gums now. So. So yes, Das also documented the offering of tormas, ritual cakes of barley and butter molded into elaborate shapes. He noted how they were consecrated by chanting and then offered to deities or discarded to appease hungry spirits. Now, the sensory details was something which fascinated him a lot, unlike the other spies who were more interested in the political affairs or mapping the routes from India to Tibet. Equally striking is his description of the butter lamp offerings and Das's account of Sakadawa, the festival commemorating the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and parinirvana. It highlights the scale of Tibetan devotion, actually. He describes incense rising in clouds, butter offerings piling up, and crowds thronging monasteries. In Sikkim and Kalimpong today, Sakadawa continues as the holiest month of the Buddhist calendar. Lay people participate by circumambulating monasteries, hoisting prayer flags, and making donations. While I may not possess a proper comprehensive set of quantitative findings at the moment, but I wish to recount an important observation from my PhD fieldwork. A significant number of people remain unaware of the threefold auspiciousness of this Sakadawa, the month of Sakadawa. So many lay people I interviewed identified Sakadawa solely as the Buddha's birthday, which strikingly, it is partially true, let's say 1/3 of its true significance, as Sakadawa, noted by Sarat Chandra Das, is the 4th month of the lunar calendar, marking not only the Buddha's birthday, but also the month of his enlightenment, nirvana, right, and subsequent passing into parinirvana. So this partial understanding leads to further misconceptions, such as the belief that Sakadawa is primarily, I quote, Sha Sama Choye Dawa. In, let's say it's, in Tibetan, we can say it's the month when eating meat is prohibited. So people in Sikkim and Kalimpong, they are of this firm belief that Sakadawa is nothing but a month where meat consumption is prohibited. So the persistence of such simplified or misinformed views over time underscores the value of ethnographic documentation built on careful explanation and the insights of knowledgeable sources. Now, other daily practices also caught Das's attention, particularly the Kora, circumambulation, and prostrations. He saw Tibetans circling monastery walls, prayer wheels in hand, murmuring mantras, sometimes dropping full length to the ground in prostration, and this embodied devotion impressed him deeply. Finally, there are rest, but then I would like to come to the final this ritual recorded by Das. He gave a fascinating account of the recognition of reincarnate lamas or tukus. He noted the process of testing children by presenting them with the belongings of a deceased lama and sometimes drawing lots in a golden vessel to confirm the choice. This process, where the spiritual and political intersected, illustrated the ritual complexity of Tibetan Buddhism. And in Sikkim today, this continues, though with greater public and even state attention. The recognition of reincarnations remain central to monastic life, showing continuity with what Das once witnessed. So here are a few other pictures, photographs of Tibetan Buddhist rituals, which Das himself captured and submitted to the Royal Geographical Survey. So talking about the documented account, early reports and diaries which were unpublished and confidential. After his two major journeys into Tibet, Das submitted confidential diaries and notes to the Government of India's Intelligence and Survey departments. The first, I went back to the problems. These included day-to-day entries, sketches, maps, and lists of Tibetan words, which he later used in the compilation of his Tibetan English dictionary. Most of this material was not published immediately. It was classified, circulated internally in British intelligence networks. Narratives of a Journey to Lhasa in Central Tibet, which has been one of the primary texts for this research as well. It was published in London by John Murray for the Royal Geographical Society and edited and introduced by Colonel H. Yule of the Book of Marco Polo fame. And this was framed as an account of exploration and espionage, detailing routes, geography, political observation, but it does not contain passages on monasteries, rituals, and social life. So this was widely read in Britain, but in India it circulated mainly among the colonial officials, Orientalists, and educated elites. So Journey to Lhasa in Central Tibet is another one. It is the expanded form, expanded version, published again by John Murray. This is the fuller travelogue, almost 500 pages, including more ethnographic details on rituals, monastic life, and festivals like this, Cham, Sakadawa, butter lamp offerings, etc. And this is the text most often cited today by the Tibetologists. Now, contributions to journals. Das contributed articles to the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal and other scholarly outlets in Calcutta. And these shorter notes often included translations of Tibetan Buddhist texts or Tibetan texts and observations on ritual practices, and a Tibetan English dictionary in 1902 by Calcutta University Press, a monumental work which was based on the manuscripts he brought from Tibet. So to present the research findings, first, he has been remembered as a spy that I have been repeating time and again in monks' robes, part of the British Pandit system of covert intelligence in Tibet. Das was not merely a gatherer of strategic data, he was also an ethnographer, one of the earliest Indians to document Tibetan Buddhist rituals with sensitivity, with precision, and even admiration. And second, the ethnographic depth of his writings becomes undeniable once we look at his ritual descriptions, his accounts of Cham mask dance, of Torma offerings molded in butter and barley flour, of the thousands of lamps being offered in Tsongkhapa's commemoration, or of the great pilgrimage festivals like Sakadawa, are not casual observations. They are carefully documented, richly detailed, and framed in a way that reveals empathy for the Tibetan worldview. And third, we find remarkable continuity between Das's records and present-day practices in the eastern Himalayas of India. Now, the paper shows that Das complicates the categories we often use. He was both spy and scholar, both colonial informant and cultural interpreter. His writing reveals Indian intellectual agency at a moment when colonial history tends to erase it. By rereading him today, we restore him to the lineage of ethnographers and translators of Tibetan culture. And we recognize that his legacy lies not in espionage, not only in espionage, but also in the preservation of ritual knowledge across borders. The findings suggest that Das should be re-evaluated, as in it's an urge that he should be re-evaluated not only as a figure of great game, but as a cultural custodian whose accounts still resonate in the living rituals of the Eastern Himalayas. So this paper urges future scholars to re-evaluate Sarat Chandra Das. He is too often remembered only as a spy, a footnote in the history of great game, right? And urge to the scholars that we read his writings carefully. We see that he was also an ethnographer, in fact, one of the first Indians to document Tibetan Buddhist rituals in depth. And to remember him only as a spy is to miss his real contribution as a cultural custodian whose writings still resonate. So before I close, I want to acknowledge a more somber side of Sarat Chandra Das's story. Even though our paper wishes to solely aim at the ethnographic aspect of his travelogues that documents Tibetan Buddhist rituals, so to say, right? His journeys into Tibet, though yielding some of the earliest and most vivid accounts of Buddhist rituals, it all came at a cost. Das could only succeed because local Tibetans, monks, guides, translators, and lay companions, they innocently helped him travel, gather information, and integrate into monastic life. But once his presence and activities became known, many of these individuals faced severe reprisals. Tibetan authorities regarded them as collaborators in espionage. Some were imprisoned and others were executed. So this tragic consequence is rather rarely, okay, the pictures now onwards has nothing to do with what I'm speaking. This tragic consequence is rarely emphasized in colonial or even modern accounts, which tend to focus on the bravery of the exploration or the value of intelligence. But for the people who lived in Tibet, the cost of innocently helping Sarat Chandra Das was very real. This, I think, forces us to reflect on the ethical responsibilities of ethnographers, historians, and cultural documentarians. Das's writings preserved rituals that still survive in Sikkim and Kalimpong today, but his work also reminds us that knowledge is never innocent. It is always produced in specific contexts and often at the expense of those who make it possible. The story of Sarat Chandra Das thus leaves us with a difficult question. How do we, as researchers, ensure that our pursuit of cultural knowledge does not harm the very communities we wish to understand and preserve? This is the sad truth and the enduring ethical challenge of ethnography. While we may celebrate Das as a spy-cum-ethnographer, we must also remember the unnamed monks and villagers whose lives bore the cost of his journeys. And I conclude with a quote from The Interpretation of Culture by Clifford Geertz. Culture is the webs of significance man himself has spun, and the analysis of it is therefore not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nyima, for a very insightful and well-researched presentation. So our next speaker is Ms. Aditi Krishna. Ms. Aditi Krishna is a doctoral research scholar working on ethic and intersection of philosophy and the literature. The title of her presentation is Mother, Daughter as a Root and a Branch, a study of female genealogy in a home in Tibet, 2013. Let's start the presentation.
Thank you, Wangmo. My name is Aditi, and I'm very happy to be here. Every year as I come, it just gets better and better, so thank you to the TPI team that conducts this conference so meticulously that it feels rewarding to come back to Chennai. This is my third time that I'm here, and I get a sense of finality because I've finally started my PhD at the University of Delhi. Prior to this, I was teaching at the Dalai Lama Institute of Higher Education in Bangalore. And those years that I spent in the college, it's a quaint, eponymous campus, I think it provided me with a lot of ethnographic material to, actually think about what I want to do in my PhD. And I have come to Tibetan literature rather late, like a detour from what I usually read. However, I arrived into the Tibetan world However, I arrived into the everyday Tibetan world before that. On Lakhar, I would watch my students who would gather for Gorshe, and they would organize everything so nicely. And some of them would not even talk in class, but outside they were very, happy to be out to be dancing, and I would not dare shake my leg. And I think that's where I realized that the joy and happiness which I saw when this song Bhoila Do would play, and everybody would, unanimously just sing Do, Do, Do. And my friend, who was also my Lotsawa, she translated the song for me, and she said, the song means, let's go to Tibet. I now understand what a moment of joy that would be, even if imagined briefly during a song. Therefore, this paper is dedicated to all my students who tap their feet with such tender yet exuberant joy that the idea of returning home, that I, their Gyakarinji Gela, could not stop herself from thinking about the meaning of home and the value we accord it. Before I start my paper, I'm aware that any analysis in literature is sort of an act of violence to the originally written text. I'm aware that I'm using someone's very sensitive and private information for my own academic pursuits. And as much as I'm grateful to Seringonpa Thompala for having written it, I'm sorry for having analyzed this memoir that I'm going to be doing today. A few weeks back, before I started writing the paper, I was wondering if there's any relevance between a daughter's memoir and politics. To be honest, I was a little hesitant until I finally finished my paper to realize that the enormity behind the power of written word. And as a daughter of a single mother myself, I found the memoir to be a gift in hindsight. So my paper is titled Ama Bhumo as Root and Branch, a study of female genealogy in a home in Tibet. I begin my paper with an epigraph, which is an Avadi folk song. I've also translated it here, but I'll be reading it in the Avadi because of the tone and incantation. The song says, Ab kab jaib deswa o rama jiara tarasiye, jab jab baheli purab se bayariya, rahiya ke amwa pe gai re koyaliya. भैया के भैल है सुनही है ललनवा, अंगना में गावत हुई अम्मा सुहरवा, अब कब जाइब देसवा ओ रामा जियरा तरसिए. An Avadi folk song about migration and longing, popular in the northern Hindi belt of India called Deshwa, evocatively sung by Malini Avasthi, describes the longing for home or desh. The song describes a yearning to return home. The married woman says that it has been long she left her own house after marriage. She has heard that her brother had a son, and the newborn must be playing in the same courtyard she used to play. There would be people who would sing Sohar songs for him. She really wishes to be there and relish the moment. Towards the middle of the song, she asks, when will the invitation come from the same courtyard in which she played with her brother as a child? Her maternal home is her country. She's asking for permission to return home, to go back to her own house. Whom is she asking? Her father, being very strict, has yet not called for her. The possibility of going unannounced is not an option. Thus, she is waiting for an invitation to return home. The refrain repeats the ache of waiting, almost like a prayer. In the folk song, the woman is asking the patriarchal head for permission to access what was once her own house. Whereas, in a home in Tibet, Seringonpa Thompala is asking the same question, but to the colonizer. How and when can I come home? Why is my visa getting denied? A pattern emerges when women are seeking permission to access spaces that are rightfully theirs. In the light of the two contexts given above, this paper examines many sides of home. The paper asks, where is a home for a woman? Where is home for an exiled woman? Where is home for displaced people in the world? When can women return to their own homes? And what are the reasons and what must they be to be qualified for a legitimate return? A few mythological references help one to understand that this return is anything but possible. Sita in Ramayana returns to her mother as the earth opens to receive her back into its embrace to end her suffering. This act of cosmic return is a final one, reclaiming her dignity by staying where she belongs, that is, with her mother. Draupadi in Mahabharata does not return dramatically, however, she is the first to fall and thus takes an exit from the material world and ascends to heaven during the great departure of Mahaprasthana. In the movie Shambhala, Pema returns to her own spiritual destination, away from the patriarchal noise of accusation. Shambhala is depicted as a quiet world where she is seen to be wearing a self-knit yellow sweater demarcating her own kingdom. In mythology, women return to the supernatural. On the other hand, Dhampala returns to Tibet in real time and place, without the supernatural. Consequently, this return, however transitory in nature, is of immense value in a geopolitical sense, as the author says, and I quote, "For me, it is the dead who bring me here. It is they who give me a place in Tibet." Professor Hani Oberoi Wahali, in Lives in Exile, exploring the inner world of Tibetan refugees, offers a visuality to the current state of Tibet. She says, Tibet, presently the largest geographical colony on this earth, symbolizes a festered wound on the body of world's conscience. End quote. However, if one were to open the world map today and look for Tibet, it would perhaps be a moot point. One cannot look up Tibet geographically on our Oxford Atlas anymore. Yet it is common knowledge that there is Tibet somewhere. This memoir, like any other memoir, is a deeply moving one, for it not only takes the reader to Tibet, but is constantly asking us to relook at what a home is. It is asking us to ponder upon the many versions of home we may inhabit. How is home looked at? Should we ask, where is our home? Who is our home? When do we feel at home? This oscillation from an object to a person to a feeling is perhaps what the author has successfully rendered in the memoir. She recalls her mother saying, when all her exile life, she waited to return home. She spoke of exile as something that would be expunged over time. When this is over, we can go home. The memoir opens in Tibet with the chapter titled Abode of Snow. The title at the onset clarifies that there is a home in Tibet, while in the prologue it states that it is not a simple story. As one reads further, it is revealed that the author's mother had died in a fatal car accident in 1994. Thereon, she takes the journey to Tibet with the intention to release her mother's ashes there. Echoing this in the memoir, Dhompa says, existing without proof or photographs or contact, this is Tibet, our real home. The visual experience of being in Tibet, I want to quote from the text. She says, the moment I acknowledge time and space, the green becomes a burden and a longing takes over me to turn away to see something else. Perhaps this desire comes with the comprehension that there is nothing I can do to get closer or away from the land. It takes my entire body to see this land, and still there is more, end quote. The memoir is a visual narrative of Tibet full of wildflowers, purple, yellow, and white. While it is also a sociological document of Tibet in real time, the visuality seeps in this narrative, is that of flowers, yaks, while tracing a female genealogy. She is, in a way, creating a new lexicon, Payul. The fatherland is nothing but the land of blooming flowers, while being in her mother's lost homeland. Much like in her childhood, when she was asked about her father's whereabouts, she would say that her Amala was both her father and mother. While revisiting Tibet, she feels the same. Now, I'm aware of the dangers of looking at a nation with a gendered lens. In India, we are aware how mothering a nation and the whole charade of Bharat Mata is nothing but sort of shameless jingoism, especially when daughters are murdered and, so on and so forth. At the same time, there is a risk of framing the mother as home may tend to romanticize the maternal and the homeland. This makes exile appear compensatory rather than ruptured. This memoir resists that simplification as we are made aware of the Chinese question time and again through many episodes. In the preface of The Politics of Sorrow, Unity and Allegiance Across Tibetan Exile, Dhompa reflects on how she was once introduced by someone as a daughter of a dissenter. She says, and I quote, somebody had introduced her as her mother was anti-government, end quote. She was 23 and had lost her only family. The associations with mother are not depicted in the hagiographical light, but are rooted in the real sense of belonging. The second part of my paper is called Many Sites of Home in Tibet. Alice Walker, in her influential collection of essays, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, A Womanist Prose, looks at her mother's gardens to collect evidence for her creativity. It is a metaphor which serves to remind the white supremacists about the creative aspects of black women. According to Walker, the creativity was in the everyday practices which included knitting, cooking, gardening. Despite the years of slavery and systematic denial to equal opportunity, the black women displayed their corpus of creativity in the everyday life. The garden is then literal and symbolic as it represents creativity, care, and survival under harsh conditions. This garden is passed on by mother to their daughters as a proof of tangible existence and a potential for change, rocky soil turning into a garden of flowers. In the same vein, Dhondup has inherited her mother's Tibet as a land of flowers, as her mother would often reminiscent about the beauty of flowers in Tibet during summer, I quote, where they looked more beautiful, taller, fragrant, vivid. Dhondup also highlights that variety of those flowers brought to her changed over time, as she would compare the riotous garden to the mundane daily objects around. I'm skipping the quote that I have mentioned here. This lack of imagination that the writer faced early on as a child is filled in by her final attempt to bid adieu to her mother's remnants as she visits Tibet. The cycle of our mother's garden being tended by daughters is continued through her journey, where she lands in Tibet and is a quiet observer of changes the land has undergone. Her ethnographic accounts of the place goes to show that the lost homeland is changing and her inherited memories may have been rather stagnant. Dhondup's first material home was a two-room house in Dharamshala, in which one room served as kitchen and the other was their everything room. This is from the essay A Nation of Two, which is published in Penguin Book of Tibetan Essays. However, her first affective home is that of Fayul as a land of flowers, which she inherited from her mother. It is not just the flowers that Tibet stood for. Dhondup also inherits the labor and loss of many women who one fine day were homeless. Therefore, the gardens of our mothers at face value can stand for the aesthetics they define. However, it is the larger artistic legacy that is being passed on. Mothers therefore become cultural carriers of cultural memory in displacement and oppression. As a daughter, this act of writing a memoir is the creation of that garden. In the Tibetan exile context, it is imperative to recognize the precarity of everyday existence in the absence of citizenship and belonging. Now, there's another part of my paper which I'll quickly read to come back to go to the conclusion. Ranajit Guha, in his timeless and incisive essay, The Small Voice of History, asks, what would history look like if women's voices were regarded as integral in the making of history? A possibility of this historiography demands rewriting, where attention must be drawn to the small voices. Dhondup's text brings to fore the agency and instrumentality into the narrative, as it is not her voice alone that we hear. It is an amalgamation of many other small voices. When she is in Tinsikha, she narrates how her mother's playmate, Yung Yang, is surprised to see a banana and asks, "Did the Chinese make this?" Sering Shakya points this out in his pioneering article, The Waterfall and the Fragrant Flowers, and elucidates how Chinese colonized the land and the minds of people simultaneously. A little insight into Yung Yang's life informs the reader about the marginalized inside Tibet. Her name means a bounty of turnip, which is a giveaway for her class as turnip grows without much effort and is consumed by poor people. Dhondup admits that Yung Yang is the poorest in the rung and nothing has changed for her. She adds, and I quote, "Yung Yang has always been poor, and under my grandfather, who was a Dhondup chief, she was given no chance to alter her life or improve her life. She would have continued to serve the family without any remuneration until the end of her days. She has not benefited under the Chinese rule either. This is not the flowery Tibet which was passed down, yet the daughter can find out about the past through post-memory." I'm not going to talk about it as it was already spoken in a previous panel. Just one second. There's another part of my paper, but I don't think so time will allow me to talk about mother work as care, so I'm going to just summarize what I have written there. In a home in Tibet, longing circulates as a central affect. The mother longs for the Tibet she left behind. The daughter longs for a Tibet she never knew. Yet this longing is not simply melancholic attachment to loss. It becomes a forward-facing orientation, one that aligns the daughter towards Tibet through her mother's stories and practices. Longing is thus productive. It shapes the daughter's sense of self, her literary vocation, and her orientation towards collective history of Tibetans in exile. Belonging to mother and by virtue belonging to Tibet. However, belonging to Tibet does create some sense of confusion. This discomfort is replaced by a sense of rootedness when Dhompa draws her connection to her mother. In the preface of The Politics of Sorrow, she recalls, and I'm quoting her, "Belonging is a conundrum even to Tibetans of my generation. Born as refugees in India and Nepal, we are not the Tibetans who had to flee from homes tucked deep within the folds of mountains and walk over Himalayas to keep alive. We are not the ones who through our labor, helped build a nation in exile under the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We are not the ones whose life choices were shaped by estrangement." All right. So the last part, I'm just going to read it through. Within the tradition of memoirs written by daughters, poignant renderings include seminal work by Simone de Beauvoir's A Very Easy Death, which is a memoir of her mother dying, Mina Alexander's Fault Line, and the latest Arundhati Roy's Mother Mary Comes to Me. A common thread that runs along these memoirs is that of a struggle for an individual identity while accrediting the internal force that drives them. Invariably, the messiness of motherhood is recognized by the daughter, reiterating a drainy rich of woman born, where she expands on the difference between motherhood as an institution which seeks to control and mothering as an experience that one chooses as a source of joy. Often, it is in the middle ground that mothers and daughters meet. The daughters, in their lived experience, accord the humanity to mothers by acknowledging how patriarchy perpetuates the myth of a good enough mother. Dhompa's memoir, while doing all of the above, attempts to highlight how instrumental mothering can be in the absence of a country. While building small units of care for sustenance, it holds the potential to recreate a sense of belonging essential in any community. In her essay, A Nation of Two, Dhompa takes note of this essence of a community and care she felt for her mother. She says, and I quote, we didn't have to make any decisions because we had few options. Our love, like our mobility, had a relationship with precarity. Unable to root ourselves wherever we were, we instead were grounded in each other, a nation for two. Tibet is politically a festered wound. Nonetheless, when viewed from the prism of maternal memories, it is a garden of plush blooms. Dhompa's memoir adds veracity to the present historical condition of Tibet. Her memoir is a recorded document that serves as a constant reminder that in a patriarchal world of fathers and colonizers, a daughter of a single woman in exile can attempt to trace her own geopolitical coordinates. This small voice is not just of a woman, but of a Tibetan whose history is time and again shredded by the dominant oppressive discourse. As the paper began with suggesting how the folk song Deshwa used the word country for home interchangeably, it is perhaps only a beginning to rethink what a home and a country means for the exiled. Perhaps the triangulation of maternal memories of an exiled daughter is best conveyed by Naira Wahi, the contemporary poet, who renders this affect delicately. She says, "My mother was my first country, the first place I ever lived." That's it. Also, I've used the artwork of Moira. Her name is Doma. I found her on Instagram and I've taken permission from her to use her work. And these I found them to be a good overlap for my paper as mother and daughter. And it's a piece of embroidery. So it's also, the metaphor sort of extends Alice Walker's, the garden metaphor. Tujhe
Thank you, Ms. Aditi. Now we will move on to the Q&A session. So anyone who wants to raise a question, we will take I think question number 1.